choose or change about the text when you read as opposed to when you write it, for the book? And then also, is there a scene or a section that you're particularly fond of for some reason, maybe even because it gave you difficulty when you were writing it?
Sure. I guess when I read, I stay pretty faithful because I'm afraid that I'm going to mess it up. So actually, I was watching. I'm watching David. He had marked different passages. It's very impressive. So I'm kind of pretty much faithful to what's in the book, unless I just sort of misread a word or something like that. As far as favorite passage, I almost read my favorite passage. It's a scene where Mark Genovich sort of bears his soul, to the sort of mystery woman while he's on the cell phone, and there's still a question as to whether or not, did he actually say this to her? Although there's another scene that I had a lot of fun writing. The easiest scene to write was the one time I put Mark into a car, because he clearly should not be driving the car. And not only is he, but he has to. He's driving a car going over the Sagamore Bridge, so for locals who know that bridge, it's terrifying enough as it is. Never mind driving all narcoleptic, so that was a fun scene to write.
Not that I do this often, but knowing that I had to read for about 10 minutes and couldn't go longer than that, I couldn't really find anything that felt 10-minutable, because it's epic fantasy continuation of what came before. Like everything's kind of tied up. So when I picked this chapter, I felt like it had a little bit of a shape to it, but it needed to be cut significantly. So if you could see what these guys saw, there's like little bits of tape and the words stop, further down start, and then stop, and then start, stop, start, start, stop, skip, start, stop, and start. I don't usually do that, but there you go. And in terms of favorite scenes, I suppose from this book, but with the other one too, with the one that came before this, it's kind of each character's. There's multiple POVs in this book, but it's each character's final scene in great measure. Even though this one ends with much of the story left to be told, those are the ones that if I'm flipping through the book, I go to the end and go, yeah, that ends well.
Yeah, I am actually. The pages are all marked up to the point where I now wonder if I actually needed all that dialogue that was in that one section, because I cut part of it in the reading. But I was actually kind of selfish because I like the white backstory. So in the novel, it doesn't actually occur in that place. So if you were reading along in any way, you'd be very confused. Another thing, yeah.
It was with a different book actually, with Pride of Carthage. But when it was translated into Italian, I guess that language makes things larger. So they said, would you please cut? We're going to cut like 30% of the book. And I said, well, okay, thanks for publishing it. And when they showed me the manuscript in English with their cuts, I was like, dude, that's all good stuff. That they did a good job. It could easily have been 30% shorter. Learning curve.
Well, I was also curious because this has come up a little bit on the Borders blog stuff that we've been doing, but not as much as some other stuff. In what ways does autobiography enter into your fiction as inspiration? I'm curious, especially with for you with regard to doing a fantasy series now, as opposed to something set in the real world.
Right.
Real world, yeah.
Well, the first thing that comes to mind, things that come to mind, I don't know if they're the things that you would be expecting the answer for. Well, it's which so much of us have, really, don't we? In our youth, our early exposure and to fantasy, and I was certainly one of those kids who didn't really read, essentially, until I discovered The Hobbits and Lloyd Alexander and Ursula K. Le Guin. They did so much for me. They're my gateway to literature. And I had written 3 historical kind of literary novels before heading into fantasy territory. But I got a hankering for fantasy because it seemed in a way dishonest to spend so much time being this literary writer without paying some tribute to the genre that got it all started for me. That got me thinking about writing fantasy. Had a story idea that was based very much around my wife's family as well, the Akarans, the age of the children, and all that. And then there's another autobiographical thing that occurs to me that affected my writing this, is that my mother died. She got cancer and died pretty quickly. And as I looked toward the next novel that I was going to do, it no longer really felt like I could say, I'll write a fantasy novel, eventually. It felt a little bit more like if I was going to do it, I might as well get to it and do it. So I really feel like that experience in my life made me go, this is important to me, so let me go there and write it. There are plenty of other ways, bits and pieces of characters and scenes as well, but that's what came to mind.
I guess in some sort of glaring, superficial ways, I say glaring because it's glaring to my family.
What does your family think of your family?
Well, I'm someone who wants to steal from everybody and everything at all times. So Mark's last name Genovich is my mother-in-law's maiden name, and Mark's mother, who's a big character in this book, Ellen Genovich, that's her name. Well, that's not her name now. She doesn't understand that. Because when she found out I named her after, because her name's Ellen Carroll now, who lives in Scituate. This is Ellen Genovich, who lives in Southie. She's like, Paul, people are going to be calling me. Like, no one's going to be calling, Ellen Carroll in Scituate. Anyway, so there's that sort of superficial aspect to it. It's written first person, present tense, so, I do think sort of his humor is a little bit of my humor. I do not have narcolepsy, but I did suffer from sleep apnea in the late 90s, so I do have some experience with excessive daytime sleepiness and sort of nodding off while you're driving. I'm much better now. I guess, and lastly, the biggest thing that I drew on personally was I lived in South Boston for 3 years, and I enjoyed it. I thought it was a great place to live, for the most part. But as I lived there, I remember distinctly feeling like an outsider. Part of that is my own neuroses, being in a big city, because I did not grow up in a big city. But I definitely felt sort of the weight of community there. And I definitely did not feel like I am Southie, because that is really all around you. It's probably lessening with the more gentrification that occurs. But when I was there in the 90s, it was still very much the We Are Southie vibe. So Mark Genovich's South Boston is my South Boston. And that was, for me, setting this novel in South Boston was just another way to sort of flip all the genre conventions. Besides Mark being very much an anti-PI, when you set something in South Boston these days with the Matt Damon films, people think Irish Catholic, close-knit, here's a Lithuanian, hardly knows anyone because of his sort of affliction he keeps to himself. So, I thought that was a very important way to use the city of South Boston, or to use it not against the reader, but to go against expectations. And that was my biggest, autobiographical piece to it.
The one thing in Finch, I sometimes tell this story, I call it the Romanian cockroach story. It's not something I can tell now because there's not enough time, but it'll actually be aired on the Sci-Fi and Sci-Fi podcast, because I did it in San Francisco, so you can hear it there. But the end of the story is that my wife and I had to crawl through 20 rows of lashed together boats to get to shore from this boat that we were on, because the Romanian Navy stopped us from going into this harbor. And there's actually a scene in Finch where there are like hundreds of lashed together boats, and Finch goes there to investigate the murder, and it's basically this kind of floating city, and it's exactly pulled out of this experience, just kind of made a little more absurd and also more symbolic, because as Finch is going through these rows of boats, he is finally realizing what danger he is in, and by the time he comes out the other side, he's in a way a different person, because his attitude towards the case has completely changed. And so that's how it kind of got changed from not a personal event in my life, but something that certainly left a mark. So I wonder if we have any questions from the audience.